Secrets have been buried for 20 years, and it only takes a small bump from an 8-year-old child to bring it all to a halt. An exhausted single mother, a cold-blooded billionaire, and a son the father never knew he had. But who's really pulling the strings behind the scenes? Still there, and they're willing to kill to keep quiet. Hit like now and comment the name of the city you're watching. I want to know how far this story has come. Don't miss a second. The afternoon light came off the water in long, flat sheets, the kind that made everything look cleaner than it was. Seabreak Cove had that quality. A coastal town that had learned to present its best face to people who could afford to see it, and to keep everything else tucked behind the service entrances and the staff parking lots and the employee break rooms that smelled like old coffee and bleach. Maren Calloway had worked the main floor of Ocean Crest Resort for 6 years. She knew every sightline in that lobby, every camera angle, every guest who tipped, and every guest who didn't. She knew which concierge would cover for her when she needed 5 minutes, and she knew that the assistant manager, Greta, kept a file on every employee who was 5 minutes late. She knew the resort the way you know a place when you have no choice but to know it. Not fondly, not bitterly, just completely. She was carrying a tray of sparkling water toward table 7 when she heard the sound. Not a crash. More like a sudden interruption. The slap of small sneakers skidding across polished marble. The low grunt of an adult absorbing unexpected impact. And then the tray in the hands of the bellhop near the entrance going sideways. Ice and glass scattering across the floor in a bright, spreading disaster. Maren turned. Evan was standing in the middle of it, chest heaving, his paper airplane crumpled somewhere behind him. 8 years old and already built like he'd been assembled from pure forward momentum, all knees and elbows and the specific kind of energy that had no internal volume control. He was staring up at the man he'd run into, and for a half second, the lobby went very quiet. The man was tall, not in the way people describe someone as tall when they mean slightly above average. He was the kind of tall that reorganized a room. Dark suit, no tie, the top button of his shirt undone in a way that looked deliberate rather than casual. Late 30s, maybe 40, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now something more complicated. Angles that had sharpened, eyes that had learned to give nothing away. He was holding Evan by both shoulders, having caught the boy before he hit the floor, and he was completely, utterly still. Maren was already moving. Evan? Her voice came out low, controlled, the specific register she'd trained herself to use in professional spaces. She set the tray on the nearest surface and crossed the lobby in 12 steps. Evan, what did I tell you about running in here? I wasn't running, You were running. She reached them and put her hand on Evan's shoulder, gently pulling him back a half step. She looked up at the man. I'm so sorry. He knows better. Are you all right? The man didn't answer immediately. That was the first thing that registered as strange. People in that lobby, guests, executives, the kind of people who arrived with reservations made 3 months in advance and luggage that cost more than Maren's monthly rent, they always had an immediate response ready. Mild irritation performed as graciousness, or actual irritation performed as something more controlled. They had scripts for moments like this. This man had no script. He was looking at Evan the way someone looks at something they can't immediately explain, something that doesn't fit into any category they already have. His hands had released the boy's shoulders, but he hadn't stepped back. His jaw was tight. There was a muscle working just below his left ear. I'm fine, he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, flat in a way that suggested he'd spent a long time making it flat. He looked at Evan for another 2 full seconds, then finally pulled his gaze up to Maren. No damage done. Let me get someone to replace whatever was spilled. I said it's fine. Not harsh, just final. He picked up the leather briefcase that had hit the floor and walked toward the check-in desk, and Maren watched him go with the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been apologizing for other people's inconvenience for 6 years and was very, very tired of it. She turned back to Evan. Go to the break room, she said quietly. Sit down. Don't touch anything. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Mom, I didn't mean to. Shh. I know you didn't mean to. Go. He went. She watched him disappear through the staff door, that particular slope to his shoulders that he got when he knew he'd crossed a line, and she picked up the tray and went back to work. The man's name was Declan Mercer. She learned that the way she learned most things about guests, through proximity and necessity. Greta circulated a brief before the private business retreat officially began the following morning. A single sheet with names and room numbers and any noted preferences, because Ocean Crest prided itself on what it called anticipatory service, which meant learning enough about wealthy people to make them feel seen without making them feel watched. Declan Mercer, venture capital. Based out of New York. No dietary restrictions noted. No +1. Preferred suite was 14A, facing the water. That was all. Maren folded the brief and put it in her apron pocket and tried not to think about the way he'd looked at Evan. The retreat ran for 5 days. She saw him at breakfast on the second morning, sitting alone at a corner table with a cup of black coffee and a laptop, not eating, scrolling through something with the focused blankness of a man performing concentration. She brought water, and he didn't look up. She saw him in the lobby that afternoon, talking on his phone with his back to the room, one hand pressed flat against the glass that overlooked the cove. She caught a single sentence as she passed. That's not what the projection showed, and you know it. Cold. Controlled. Someone was getting taken apart on the other end of that call. She saw him in the corridor near the service stairs on the third evening, and that time he did look up, and their eyes met for a moment that lasted about half a second too long before she looked away and kept walking. On the fourth morning, Evan was there again. She'd asked the resort's childcare coordinator to keep him occupied. Saturdays were complicated, his school was closed, and her usual sitter had canceled with 4 hours' notice. Maren had spent 20 minutes on the phone trying to rearrange the day before accepting the only available option, which was letting Evan sit in the small courtyard garden off the main building while she worked, under the loose supervision of the groundskeeper, who was a patient man named Otis, who didn't mind kids as long as they stayed out of the flower beds. Evan had stayed out of the flower beds. He had, however, found his way to the small stone bench near the garden's eastern gate, which abutted the walkway that Declan Mercer apparently used for his morning calls. Maren found out because Otis came to get her. "They're just talking," Otis said preemptively, which was how she knew she was going to find something she didn't want to find. She came around the hedge and stopped. Evan was sitting on the bench with his elbows on his knees, in the posture he adopted when he was explaining something he found genuinely fascinating. Declan Mercer was sitting 3 feet away on the low garden wall, his phone nowhere in evidence, his jacket over his arm, looking at Evan with an expression she couldn't immediately name. Not predatory, not even particularly warm. Just intent. The way a person looks when they're listening to something that doesn't make sense yet, and they're waiting for the piece that will make it make sense. And the wingspan has to be exactly right, otherwise it just nosedives, Evan was saying, demonstrating with his hands. And most people make the fold too steep, but the trick is you actually want a slight curve. Evan. Maren's voice came out sharper than she intended. Both of them looked at her. Evan immediately registered that he was in some kind of trouble, though he couldn't have said why. Declan Mercer stood, and something shifted in his face. The intent expression closing down, replaced by the neutral blankness she'd seen at the check-in desk. "He wasn't bothering me," Mercer said. "He's supposed to be in the garden." "This is the garden." "The other part of the garden." A pause. Evan slid off the bench and came to stand beside her, and she put her hand on his shoulder, and she saw Declan Mercer look at that. At her hand on Evan's shoulder, at the two of them standing together. And something moved behind his eyes that she couldn't read. "He's yours," Mercer said. Not a question. "He is." She kept her voice level. "Come on, Evan." She walked Evan back through the hedge and handed him to Otis and went back to her station. And she told herself the conversation meant nothing, and she almost believed it. He found her on the 4th afternoon. The main floor was quiet between lunch and the dinner prep window, and Maren was doing inventory near the service bar when she heard footsteps that weren't staff footsteps, the unhurried cadence of someone who had nowhere to be and had decided to be here instead. She didn't turn around. "Miss Calloway." She turned around. He was standing just inside the service entrance, which guests were not supposed to use, and he looked faintly incongruous there among the supply shelves and the stacked linen carts, too expensive and too composed for the space. He had his hands in his pockets, which she had noticed was something he did when he was trying to appear less formidable, and it didn't work. "This area is for staff," she said. "I know. I asked where I might find you." She set down her clipboard. "What do you need, Mr. Mercer? I can get someone from the concierge." "I don't need the concierge." He looked at her steadily. "I need to ask you something, and I'd like you to hear me out before you shut it down." That's an interesting way to start a conversation. I've been told I'm not good at small talk. He didn't look apologetic about it. "Your son, how old is he?" The air in the room shifted about 3 degrees. Marin felt it in the back of her neck, that prickling awareness of standing at the edge of something. "I don't discuss my son with guests," she said. "I'm not asking as a guest. I'm asking because—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, tried again. "Because he looks exactly like photographs I have of myself at that age." The words landed quietly, almost gently. And they were, she realized, the most dangerous sentence she had ever heard, because it was not accusatory, and it was not aggressive, and it was not any of the things she'd spent 8 years steeling herself against. It was just a man standing in a service corridor telling her something that scared him. She didn't let that matter. "Lots of kids look like lots of people," she said. "It's a coincidence." "Maybe." He wasn't moving. "Or maybe not. I'd like to know which one." "Mr. Mercer." "Declan." "Mr. Mercer." She picked up her clipboard again. "I think you should go back to your retreat." He studied her for a moment. The muscle below his left ear was working again, the one she'd noticed in the lobby on the first day. "I'm not going to create a problem," he said. "That's not what this is." "What is it then?" "I don't know yet." He said it with the particular flatness of someone telling the exact truth. "But I think you do." He left. Marin stood very still for a long time, her clipboard in her hands, and she breathed carefully, in and out, the way she'd taught herself to breathe during moments when the ground shifted beneath her without warning. She was good at that. She'd had 8 years of practice. She told herself she wouldn't think about Seabreak Cove the way it had been 9 years ago, before the resort expansion, when the South Docks were still accessible to the public and the sailing club ran charity regattas that local businesses co-sponsored in exchange for goodwill and tax deductions. She told herself that, and then she sat in her car in the employee parking lot that night after her shift and thought about nothing else. One evening, one storm that had come up fast off the Atlantic, faster than anyone had predicted, and the regatta organizers had made the call to shelter the volunteers overnight in the harbor master's office and the adjoining boathouse while the weather passed. 14 people, sleeping bags on hardwood floors, the sound of rain hammering the tin roof, the smell of rope and salt water, and a man she'd talked to for 6 hours straight, a man she'd met that morning and felt like she'd known forever, a man who'd made her laugh in the specific way that felt like recognition rather than performance, and who'd looked at her when she spoke like what she was saying was the most interesting thing he'd heard in years. He'd told her his name. He told her he was in the city for a friend's funeral, that he'd volunteered for the regatta because he needed to do something with his hands. He hadn't said much about his family, and she hadn't pushed, because the night felt fragile in the particular way that nights feel fragile when you know they're temporary, and you don't want to break them by asking for more than they're offering. His name had been Declan. She'd known it the moment she read the brief. She'd known it and told herself she was wrong, told herself it was a common enough name, told herself that the man in the lobby with the expensive suit and the carved stone composure was not the same man who had sat across from her on a boathouse floor in the middle of a rainstorm and told her that he'd never felt like he belonged anywhere. But he was. And the only question now, the only question that had any real weight, was what she was going to do about it. She started her car, drove home through the coastal dark, went upstairs and stood in the doorway of Evan's room for a moment, watching him sleep, the way she did most nights, that particular mixture of love and fear and exhaustion that was the central texture of her life. Evan slept with one arm thrown over his head, which was something Marin had always done, and his jaw, even relaxed in sleep, had that same set to it, that particular angle she'd been looking at all day in a man who claimed not to know he had a son. Marin closed Evan's door very quietly and sat down on the floor of the hallway with her back against the wall, and she thought about the 9 years of silence, and the letter she'd written that had never been answered, and the second letter she'd written 6 months later that had also never been answered, and the decision she'd made after that, the decision that this was her life and her son, and she would build something real out of it without waiting for a man who had clearly decided she was not worth coming back for. She had built something. It wasn't what she'd dreamed, but it was real, and it was hers, and Evan was extraordinary, and she did not need Declan Mercer to walk into the Ocean Crest Resort and start looking at her son like he was a miracle he'd lost the receipt for. She did not need that at all. She pressed her palms flat against the floor and breathed, in and out, and told herself that tomorrow she would be professional and distant, and he would check out on Friday, and that would be the end of it. She told herself that, and she was almost certain she was lying. He talked. The fifth morning, he was waiting for her at the staff entrance before her shift, not pacing, not checking his phone, just standing there with his coffee, like he had nowhere more important to be than a parking lot behind a resort at 6:50 in the morning. The confidence of it, the sheer self-possessed stillness, made something twist in her chest that was equal parts anger and something she didn't want to name. "You can't be back here," she said. "I checked out this morning." He held up the keycard between two fingers. "I'm not a guest anymore. Technically, I'm just a person standing in a parking lot." "What do you want, Declan?" She used his first name without meaning to. She watched him register it, a small tightening around his eyes, the closest thing to an expression she'd seen crack through the composure. "I want to know if he's my son," he said. No preamble, no softening. The words hit her like cold water. Not because they surprised her, but because hearing them aloud made something inside her that had been braced for years suddenly, unexpectedly, buckle. "He's my son," she said. "I know he's yours. That's not what I asked." The parking lot was quiet. Gulls somewhere overhead. The smell of the water. Marin stared at him and thought about all the ways this conversation could go, all the versions of it she'd run through her head at some point in the last 8 years. And none of them felt adequate for the actual moment of standing in front of him in the flat gray morning light. "You never called," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it for being steady. "I wrote to you twice. You never responded." Something happened to his face. "What letters?" he said. And the way he said it, the specific quality of confusion in it, sharp and immediate. Not defensive, not guilty, just genuinely uncomprehending to stopped her cold. "What do you mean, what letters?" she said. "I mean, I never received any letters." He was very still. "Marin, I left for London 6 days after the regatta. My father had died. I found out the next morning I had to leave. I didn't have your number and I didn't know how to—" He stopped. His jaw tightened. "I spent 2 years trying to find you. I didn't know your last name. I knew the sailing club, but you weren't registered as a volunteer. You'd signed in under the business name, and I couldn't—" Another stop. "Where did you send the letters?" "The address you gave me," she said. "The Mercer address. Upper East Side." The silence that followed lasted about 4 seconds. It was the longest 4 seconds of her life. "That address," Declan said very quietly, "was managed by my guardian, my father's estate manager. He handled all my correspondence while I was overseas." He looked at her, and something behind his eyes was doing something she couldn't name. Not quite grief, not quite rage. Something colder and more dangerous than either. "His name is Warren Holt. He managed everything." Marin felt the ground shift again, that seismic sensation she'd grown so good at absorbing. "He never forwarded them," she said. "It wasn't a question." "No," Declan said. "I don't think he did." She looked at him. He looked at her. And somewhere between them, in the flat morning air of a coastal parking lot, 9 years of absence reorganized itself into something that was not abandonment at all. Something that was not abandonment at all, but something worse. Something deliberate. Marin's mouth had gone dry. She was aware of the texture of the asphalt under her shoes, the weight of her bag on her shoulder, the sound of a delivery truck reversing somewhere on the other side of the building. Ordinary details. The kind your brain reaches for when it needs something solid to hold on to while everything else rearranges itself. "He knew," she said. I don't know that yet. You just said, I said, I don't know. Declan's voice was controlled, but the control was costing him something. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular stillness of a man holding himself in place by an act of will. I know the letters didn't reach me. I don't know what that means yet. What does it need to mean? She heard her own voice go flat. He intercepted them. He made a choice. I need to be sure before I say that out loud. Why? Because if I say it out loud, he said quietly, I'm going to do something about it. And I'd like to know exactly what I'm doing something about before I start. She looked at him for a long moment. The gulls were louder now, circling something out over the water. The morning light was starting to come on properly, burning the gray off the horizon. There's a coffee place on Anchor Street, she said finally. I have 40 minutes before my shift. He nodded once. That was all. The coffee place was called Dune, and it smelled like roasted beans, and the particular kind of quiet that exists in establishments that open early for fishermen and shift workers. No music, no ambient noise design, just the sound of an espresso machine and two other customers who had no interest in anyone else's business. They sat across from each other at a corner table, and for a moment neither of them spoke, and Marin looked at his hands wrapped around his cup and thought about how strange it was to be sitting across from someone whose absence had shaped the last 9 years of her life. Tell me about the letters, he said. Tell me about London first. He looked at her. Then he set his cup down. My father had a stroke while I was at the regatta. They didn't reach me until the next morning. I had to leave within the hour. I didn't have time. He stopped, exhaled through his nose. That's not an excuse. I should have found a way to reach you. I didn't have your number. I didn't have your last name. I knew the name of your employer from something you'd said, but I couldn't remember which one, and Another stop. I was managing an estate, a board transition, a legal restructuring, all of it while grieving a man I hadn't fully figured out how to love yet. And by the time I surfaced enough to think clearly, 6 months had passed, and I didn't know where to start. Marin listened. She kept her face neutral. Warren Holt, she said. How long has he managed your affairs? Since I was 19. He was my father's executor. After the stroke, he stayed on to oversee the trust. He had power of attorney during my first year in London. Declan's jaw was tight. He handled all inbound correspondence at the estate, everything physical. I sent 2 letters, Marin said. The first one was 3 months after the regatta. I told you I was pregnant. I asked you to call me if you wanted to be involved, and I told you I understood if you didn't. I included my number. She kept her voice even. The second one was 6 months after Evan was born. I included a photograph. Declan said nothing. His hands around the cup were very still. I waited another 3 months, she said. Then I stopped waiting. Marin, I'm not done. She met his eyes. I decided you'd made your choice, and I made mine. And I built a life for my son that he doesn't need dismantled because you've suddenly decided to show up in a parking lot 9 years late. I'm not trying to dismantle anything. Then what are you trying to do? I'm trying to understand what was taken from me. His voice didn't rise, but the flatness in it deepened, became something with more weight. If those letters were intercepted, if Warren deliberately kept this from me, then someone decided I didn't get to know I had a son. Someone made that choice for me. And I would like, he said, each word placed carefully, to know who did that and why, and what else they've been doing with my life while I wasn't looking. The espresso machine hissed. One of the other customers scraped his chair back and left. Marin looked at the table, then back at him. He's extraordinary, she said. It came out before she'd decided to say it, quieter than she intended. Evan. He's the most extraordinary person I've ever met. And I'm not saying that because I'm his mother. I'm saying it because it's objectively true. He taught himself to read music from YouTube videos. He builds things. He argues with me like a trial lawyer, and he's 8. She pressed her mouth together. He didn't need you. He doesn't need you. But he has asked me about his father 4 times in the last 2 years, and I haven't known what to say. Declan was very still. What did you say? He asked. I said his father was a good man who didn't know he existed. She looked up. I chose to believe that. Even when I was furious, I chose to believe it, because I didn't want Evan to carry anger towards someone he'd never met. She paused. Turns out I was right for the wrong reasons. The silence stretched. Outside, the street was beginning to fill with morning traffic, the ordinary sounds of a coastal town starting its day. I want to meet him, Declan said. Properly. I don't mean I'm going to show up and announce. He stopped, ran a hand over his jaw. I'm not going to create a crisis. But I need to know if he's my son, and if he is, I need to figure out how to... A DNA test, she said. Yes. All right. She said it before she'd finished deciding, which was unusual for her. She was typically a person who finished deciding before she spoke. But something about the morning, about the way he'd said what was taken from me, had shifted something she hadn't expected. I'll arrange it, discreetly. And while we wait for the results, you will not contact Evan, you will not contact my employer, and you will not discuss this with anyone. Agreed. And if the results say what we both already know they say, she held his gaze. Then we talk again. About what comes next. About what's appropriate. About what Evan is ready for. She paused. Not about what you're ready for. About what he is. Declan looked at her for a moment with something she might, in another context, have called respect. Agreed, he said again. Ishit. The results took 8 days. 8 days during which Marin worked her shifts and picked Evan up from school and helped him with a science project about tidal patterns, and made dinner and listened to him explain the aerodynamic difference between a dart fold and a Nakamura lock in paper airplane construction, and tried very hard not to think about the DNA kit sitting in the back of her closet, or the man who was presumably somewhere in the city waiting, or the specific way his eyes had looked when she'd said, "He's extraordinary." She thought about all of it constantly. The result came on a Thursday morning, through the private medical service she'd used, to an email address she'd created specifically for this purpose. She opened it in her car, in the resort parking lot, 20 minutes before her shift started. Probability of paternity, 99.998%. She sat with that number for a while. She'd known. She'd known since the lobby, had known with some wordless certainty the moment she'd turned and seen Declan Mercer holding her son by the shoulders, looking at him like the ground had opened up. But knowing and confirmation were different things. Confirmation had weight. Confirmation meant the next step was no longer theoretical. She texted him from the number she'd given him. Just the word, confirmed. He called within 30 seconds. I need to find Warren's records, he said, no preamble. I need to know if he has those letters. What good does that do? It tells me if this was deliberate or just negligence. It tells me if there's anything else. Letters are physical evidence. If he kept them, why would he keep them? Because Warren Holt keeps everything, Declan said, and there was something in his voice she hadn't heard before. A bitter familiarity, the tone of someone describing a person they thought they knew. He documents everything. It's how he operates. He doesn't destroy, he archives. He thinks documentation is protection. A pause. It might be the thing that unmakes him. But she met Warren Holt 3 days later, which was not something she had planned or agreed to. She came out of the resort's side exit at the end of her afternoon shift, and he was standing beside her car. 60, maybe 65, the kind of heavy set that came from decades of good restaurants. Silver hair, perfectly parted. A suit that cost more than her monthly rent. He was holding his hands loosely in front of him, a posture that was probably meant to read as relaxed and read, instead as rehearsed. Marin's whole body went cold. Ms. Calloway. His voice was warm and completely empty. I wonder if we might have a brief conversation. How do you know who I am? Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Declan mentioned meeting someone at the resort. I wanted to introduce myself. He smiled. The smile didn't reach anything. I've known Declan since he was a boy. I consider myself something of a guardian to him, even now. He's 40 years old. Yes. The smile stayed exactly where it was. Some people require more looking after than others. Declan has always had a tendency toward impulsive decisions, particularly where women are concerned. I just wanted to make sure you understood the nature of Mr. Holt. She shouldered her bag. I don't know you. You don't know me. Whatever you're about to suggest about the nature of anything, I'd encourage you to think very carefully before you finish that sentence. The smile went away. Underneath it was something she recognized from the hardest moments of her life, the particular flatness of a person who had never been told no by someone they'd underestimated. You're in a complicated position, he said. A resort employee, a single mother. What you're reaching for here, what Declan thinks he wants right now in this moment, isn't going to hold. Men like Declan have these, a pause, episodes of conscience. They pass. What doesn't pass is the damage they do to people who aren't equipped to protect themselves. Are you threatening me? I'm advising you. Those are the same thing. He looked at her for a moment, then he straightened his jacket. The Mercer estate, he said, is a significant entity. Its affairs are managed with great care. Introducing destabilizing claims into that environment, particularly claims that are difficult to verify. There's nothing difficult to verify, she said. We've already verified it. The temperature of the air between them dropped about 10 degrees. She watched his face do something small and quick, a flicker of calculation, gone almost before she could identify it. He hadn't known. Declan hadn't told him. He'd come here fishing, and she'd just confirmed what he was fishing for. She had the sudden vertiginous sensation of having made a mistake. I see, he said softly. Well, he adjusted his cufflinks. I hope you'll be thoughtful about how you proceed, for the boy's sake, if nothing else. He walked away. She watched him go, and her hand was shaking slightly around the strap of her bag, and she made herself breathe in and out before she reached for her phone. Declan picked up on the second ring. He knows, she said. Warren. He came to my car. The silence on the other end lasted exactly 1 second. Get Evan, Declan said. His voice had gone completely flat. Don't go home first. Pick him up from school right now and take him somewhere that isn't your apartment. Declan, Marin, listen to me. A beat. I know how Warren operates. He doesn't warn people unless he's already decided on a next step. The warning is just him being courteous to himself. His voice was steady, but underneath the steadiness she could hear something she hadn't heard from him before. Something urgent and barely controlled. Please, get Evan. I'll explain everything, but I need you to move first. She was already walking toward her car. Where do I take him? There's a woman named Diane Cowell. She's a former colleague of mine. She lives in Seabright Cove. I'll text you her address. She doesn't know Warren. She doesn't appear in any of my professional records. She's safe. He paused. Tell her I sent you. She'll understand. What are you doing? Going to get the letters, he said. Declan. But he'd already ended the call. She got in her car and pulled out of the parking lot and drove toward Evan's school with both hands tight on the wheel, her mind moving fast through everything Warren Holt had said and everything he hadn't, and the particular way his face had changed when she'd told him the test was done. She thought about a man who kept everything, who archived instead of destroyed, who had spent 9 years sitting on evidence of what he'd done, certain it would never matter, certain the woman who'd sent those letters would never become relevant enough to threaten him. She thought about how much had shifted in the space of 10 days, and she thought, with a clarity that felt almost like calm, that this was no longer a story about a lost father and a hidden son. This was something else now. She turned onto Evans Street and saw his school in the middle distance, kids beginning to filter out the front gate, and she scanned the sidewalk until she found him. Evan, backpack half open, arguing with some kid about something, gesturing with both hands the way he did when he was making a point he was very sure of. She pulled to the curb and got out. Mom? Evan frowned at her. You're early. I know. She kept her voice light. Change of plans. Come on. He looked at her face, really looked, the way he sometimes did, with that uncanny precision that occasionally made her feel transparent, and something shifted in his expression. Are we okay? He asked. She opened the car door for him. We're going to be, she said. And somewhere across town, in an Upper East Side estate that Declan Mercer hadn't set foot in for 7 years, The man who had stolen 9 years from all three of them was opening his phone and making a call of his own. And the thing that had been buried was about to claw its way to the surface whether Warren Holt wanted it to or not. Declan drove with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. The Mercer estate was 40 minutes outside Seabrake Cove, up through the coastal hills where old money had built itself stone walls and long driveways, and the particular privacy that came from acreage. He hadn't been back in 7 years. He'd bought his own place in the city, managed the trust remotely, let Warren run the physical estate the way Warren had always run everything, efficiently, thoroughly, and with the quiet authority of a man who had made himself indispensable across 4 decades of Mercer family business. That was the thing about Warren. He didn't accumulate power the way aggressive men accumulated power, loudly, visibly, leaving marks. He accumulated it the way ivy accumulated on stone walls, slowly, thoroughly, until the day you tried to pull it off and realized it had grown into the mortar, had become structural, and taking it down meant taking down part of the wall with it. Declan had understood that about Warren for years in an abstract sense. He was understanding it now in a much more specific one. He turned off the coastal highway onto the private road and felt the familiar transition. Asphalt to packed gravel, the canopy of old oaks closing overhead, the light going amber and filtered. The house appeared at the end of the drive the way it always had, gray stone and dark windows, built in the 1890s by a Mercer who had made his money in shipping and spent it on permanence. It had always looked less like a home than like an argument for a certain kind of life, the kind that was correct by definition because it had lasted. He parked and sat for a moment. Warren's car was not in the drive, which meant Warren was not here, which meant the call Marin had interrupted, the call Warren was making when Declan had told her to move, was being made from somewhere else. Somewhere Warren had gone after visiting Marin's parking lot, after realizing the situation had already progressed beyond what he'd planned for. Declan got out of the car. He had a key. He'd always had a key. Warren had never changed the locks because Warren had never imagined a version of events in which Declan would come here alone, unannounced, looking for something specific. Warren's entire management of the Mercer affairs had been built on the assumption that Declan trusted him, had built itself into the mortar of that trust and expanded there, slow and thorough and invisible. He let himself in through the side entrance, the one that opened directly into the estate office, because Warren kept his archives in the estate office, had done so for decades, and Declan knew the room the way you know a room from childhood. The particular smell of it, old paper and lemon polish, the 2 tall filing cabinets against the north wall, the desk that had been his father's before Warren claimed it. The filing cabinets were locked. Declan stood in front of them for a moment, his hands at his sides, and thought about Warren's habits. Warren who kept everything. Warren who believed in documentation as protection. Warren who had structured an entire system of management around the principle that information was power and power required maintenance. He went to the desk. The desk key was in the middle drawer. The middle drawer key was on the key ring Warren kept in the ceramic dish by the side entrance, the one with the broken lid that had been broken since Declan was 12 and had never been replaced because Warren never prioritized aesthetics over function. Declan had watched him drop that key ring in that dish 1,000 times. He retrieved it. He unlocked the desk, and in the bottom left drawer beneath a stack of quarterly trust reports, he found what he'd suspected Warren might have. Not the letters themselves, not yet, but a secondary ledger, handwritten. The kind of meticulous parallel record that men like Warren kept because they didn't entirely trust their own digital systems. He sat in his dead father's chair and opened it. It took him 22 minutes to understand what he was reading because the ledger was dense and cross-referenced and written in the compressed shorthand Warren had used for 40 years. A private notation system that Declan had seen the edges of but never studied. But some things didn't need decoding. Dates were dates. Dollar amounts were dollar amounts. And names, when Warren bothered to use them at all, were names. The first entry that stopped him was dated 11 years ago, 3 years before the regatta, 2 years before his father's stroke. A transfer. Not large. $40,000 moved from a subsidiary account to something listed only as consulting, external. No payee named, no service described. He turned pages. The transfers appeared irregularly. Every 8 to 14 months, varying amounts, always from subsidiary accounts, always to unnamed external consultants. They added up, over the span of the ledger, to something close to $2 million across 8 years. He kept reading. 15 minutes in, he found the first notation that wasn't financial. CM correspondence. Received, filed, no action. DM overseas, recovery period, per protocol. CM Callaway, Marin, per protocol. Which meant there was a protocol. Which meant Warren had thought about this in advance, had anticipated that correspondence from an unknown woman might arrive during Declan's absence, had decided in advance what to do with it, had called it a protocol, which meant it had a name, which meant it had a procedure, which meant it had not been a spontaneous decision made once in a moment of misguided paternalism. It had been a policy. Declan turned more pages, found a second notation, 7 months later. CM, follow-up received, photo enclosed, filed. DM board transition ongoing, not appropriate timing per my assessment. Held for future disposition, held for future disposition. He stared at those 4 words for a long time. His hands on the ledger were completely steady, which surprised him because what was moving through his chest was not steady at all. It was the specific kind of rage that had no heat in it, that had gone so far past hot that it had come out the other side cold and very, very precise. He turned to the back section of the ledger. There was a reference number, a cabinet number, a drawer number, a file designation. Warren's archive system applied to stolen correspondence from a woman who'd written to tell a man he had a son. Declan got up, went to the filing cabinets, and used the desk key on the lock. The letters were in a manila folder labeled with Marin's reference number, both of them exactly as she'd described. The first one handwritten on plain white paper, the second one typed, with a photograph paper clipped to the front. Evan, 8 months old. Sitting up slightly, one hand gripping the edge of something off-frame, looking at the camera with an expression of complete concentration that was, and Declan felt something crack open somewhere behind his sternum. That was his own expression. Exactly. He had photographs of himself at that age, and this was the same face, the same particular focused intensity, the same slightly too serious look for an infant. He stood in Warren's filing room holding a photograph of his son at 8 months old, a photograph that had been sitting in a manila folder in a locked cabinet for 8 years. And the crack in his chest widened, and he put the photograph down very carefully on top of the cabinet because he didn't trust his hands with it right now. He took the folder, he closed the cabinet, he locked it, put the desk key back on the ring, put the ring back in the ceramic dish with the broken lid. He walked out the side entrance and got in his car and drove. He called his attorney from the road, not his corporate attorney, his personal one, a woman named Ruth Kessler, who had represented him in private matters for 6 years and who had the specific quality he needed right now, which was that she knew exactly what questions to ask and didn't ask anything else. I have physical evidence of mail interception going back 9 years, he said, potentially affecting a paternity matter. I also have what appears to be a pattern of unauthorized transfers from trust subsidiary accounts across 8 years. I need to know how fast we can move, and I need to know who else needs to be in the room. Ruth was quiet for 2 seconds. Is the evidence secure? I have it with me. Photographs of the originals? I'm stopping now. He pulled onto the shoulder, took his phone out, photographed every page of the folder with methodical care, then the relevant ledger pages he'd also taken, then sent the images to Ruth's secure server. Done. All right, don't go back to that property. Where is the subject of the paternity matter? Safe. I'll explain when I'm there. Come to my office, 2 hours. A pause. Declan, this is going to get complicated. I know. How complicated are you prepared for it to get? He looked at the photograph he'd set on the passenger seat. Evan at 8 months, looking at the camera like he was trying to figure out how it worked. As complicated as it needs to, he said. He was 40 minutes from Ruth's office when his phone rang. Unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Then something made him pull over and pick up. Mr. Mercer? A man's voice. Careful, professional, the kind of voice that belonged to someone who made difficult calls for a living. My name is Thomas Greer. I work for the Mercer Family Trust in a compliance capacity. I'm calling because I've been asked to inform you that the Trust's Board of Advisors has convened an emergency session this afternoon. Declan's grip on the phone tightened. About what? There are concerns, Greer said, about the nature of a recent inquiry you've made regarding Trust subsidiary accounts. The board wants to discuss the matter before any external parties are consulted. A pause. Mr. Holt has indicated that he believes the inquiry may be based on a misunderstanding, and he'd like the opportunity to clarify. The board convened this afternoon. Yes, sir. Who called the session? A beat. Mr. Holt, in his capacity as estate manager. He doesn't have the authority to call board sessions. That requires 2 trustees. He was joined in that request by Mr. Fenwick. Another pause. Arthur Fenwick, the Trust's senior financial trustee. Declan went very still. Arthur Fenwick had been on the Mercer Trust Board for 22 years. He was 68 years old, had a reputation for impeccable discretion and rigorous ethics, and had sat across from Declan at 3 separate trust reviews with an expression of such steady, impartial professionalism that Declan had never once considered that he might be anything other than exactly what he appeared to be. $2 million. Dispersed across 8 years to unnamed external consultants, $40,000 a year roughly. Split between how many people? Tell them I'll be there, Declan said. He ended the call and sat on the shoulder of the road with both hands on the wheel, recalculating everything. It wasn't just Warren. Warren was methodical and self-interested, but ultimately small, the kind of man who managed other people's power and mistook proximity to it for the thing itself. Warren wouldn't have sustained this for 8 years alone. Warren didn't have enough at stake. Warren's motivation was control, and control required an object, and the object had always been the Mercer estate. And protecting the estate didn't require keeping Declan isolated from a woman and a child unless someone else had given Warren a reason to, unless someone had been paying Warren to keep Declan exactly where Warren had kept him. Compliant, manageable, focused on the business and not on anything that might make him ask questions about the business. He texted Ruth. Board session called for today. Fenwick involved. I think the transfers were payment. Need you there. She responded in 30 seconds. Don't walk in without me. Pick me up on the way. Ruth Kessler was 53, 5'4", and wore her silver hair cut close to her skull in a way that read as someone who had stopped performing softness a long time ago. She got into the car with a leather document case and the expression of someone who had already been running scenarios for the last 2 hours. Tell me everything, she said. He told her. All of it. From the lobby collision to the ledger to the phone call, without editing and without pause. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was one of the things he'd always valued about her. She understood that the first telling of a thing had to be uninterrupted or you lost something in the compression. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Fenwick, she said. Yes. You're sure about the transfers? I photographed the ledger. I sent you the pages. I've looked at them. She opened her document case and handed him a printed sheet. She'd already printed them, had already been working. The disbursement pattern is consistent with a retainer arrangement. Fixed intervals, variable amounts within a consistent range. It's what you'd pay someone for ongoing management. She said the word with a precision that made it mean something specific. Not a consultant, a fixer. Warren was the fixer, Declan said. Fenwick was the client. If that's true, then Fenwick has been using trust funds to pay the estate manager to manage you. She looked at him over the top of her reading glasses. For 8 years. Which means this isn't about the letters. The letters were one piece of a much longer project. What project? Ruth was quiet for a moment. What happens to the Mercer Trust? She said carefully. If you had acknowledged a child 9 years ago? He thought about it, ran the trust documents in his head. The ones he knew, the ones he'd signed, the ones he'd inherited without reading closely enough. The trust distribution structure would have shifted. A direct heir changes the allocation schedule. It would have affected the board's discretionary authority over... He stopped. Over approximately $60 million in investable assets, Ruth said quietly. that the board has had discretionary authority over for the last 9 years, during which time those assets have been managed by a series of funds in which Arthur Fenwick holds private stakes. The car was very quiet. He's been stealing from the trust, Declan said. I think the word you're looking for is laundering, Ruth said. And I think he's been doing it for a very long time, and I think Warren Holt has been helping him keep the architecture of it clean. And I think you having an heir 9 years ago would have required a trust restructuring that would have exposed all of it. She closed the document case. The letters weren't intercepted to protect Declan Mercer from a distraction. They were intercepted to protect a criminal enterprise from discovery. Evan, 8 months old in a photograph, sitting in a filing cabinet. Not a distraction. A threat. A small, unwitting, 8-month-old threat to $60 million and 20 years of careful theft. Declan turned onto the road that led to the Mercer Estate's secondary meeting house, where the board session had been called, and thought about what he was walking into with a manila folder and an attorney and evidence that 2 men in that room had spent years hoping he would never find. They'll try to discredit the ledger, he said. Yes. Warren will say it's internal shorthand, that the notations don't mean what I think they mean. Yes. And the transfers will be characterized as legitimate consulting arrangements that were improperly documented. That's my guess? Ruth looked at him. Which is why the meeting today is not the fight. Today is reconnaissance. You let them think they have the upper hand, you listen to everything they say, and you let them commit to a story. She paused. And then we take everything to the Federal Financial Crimes Unit before they have time to shred anything. They'll move fast once they know I'm coming. They're already moving. She said it without alarm. Which is why I made 2 calls while you were driving. There's a hold request on all Mercer Trust account activity as of 40 minutes ago, pending a compliance review. They can't transfer, can't restructure, can't liquidate. A small pause. I have a former SEC colleague who owes me a favor and takes this kind of thing personally. He looked at her. You started this before you knew about Fenwick, he said. I started it the moment you described the ledger pattern. She settled the document case on her knees. I've been doing this for 30 years, Declan. I know what a payment structure looks like. He pulled into the long gravel drive and saw the meeting house ahead. Lights on in the main room, 2 unfamiliar cars in the lot beside Warren's silver sedan. He did not yet see Fenwick's car, which meant Fenwick was either already inside or not coming in person, and the latter option worried him more than the former. He parked and turned off the engine. One more thing, Ruth said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the meeting house with the particular stillness of someone making a final calculation. The woman, Marin, and the boy. They're with someone safe. They need to stay that way. If Fenwick understands what he's about to lose, the calculus around them changes. She turned to look at him now, and her expression was not unkind, but it had the weight of someone saying something that needed to be heard. You should understand that. Going in there changes things for them whether you intend it to or not. There's no version of today where everything stays quiet. He thought about Evan in the car with Marin, backpack half open, arguing with some kid about something. He thought about Marin's hands on the steering wheel, driving toward her son with her jaw set and her voice carefully level. He thought about a photograph in a manila folder in a locked cabinet, 8 years of a child's life that had been treated as a liability to be managed. I know, he said. He got out of the car. Warren was standing at the window when Declan walked in, which was the position of a man who had heard the car on the gravel and had spent 30 seconds deciding how to arrange himself. He turned with the smooth unhurriedness of someone performing calm, and his expression was concerned. Warmly, paternally concerned, the expression he'd been using on Declan since Declan was 19 years old, and it had always worked. Declan. He came forward. I'm glad you're here. I want to explain. Don't. Declan kept walking to the center of the room. Sit down, Warren. Warren stopped. The warmth in his expression underwent a small, precise recalibration. Not disappearing, just adjusting, like a lens being refocused. He sat. There were 2 other men in the room. Trust administrators, both of them, both of whom Declan recognized and neither of whom he knew well. They sat with the careful neutrality of people who had been told something and didn't yet know which side of it to be on. Arthur Fenwick was not present. "Where's Fenwick?" Declan said. "Arthur sends his regrets," Warren said. "He's been delayed. He asked me to convey he's not coming. He'll join by phone when he's not coming because he's not stupid," Declan said. "He knows I wouldn't come here without documentation, and he doesn't want to be in a room where documentation is produced." He looked at Warren. "Did he call you after he found out the accounts are frozen?" Something moved in Warren's face. Very small, very fast. "I don't know what you mean," Warren said. "The trust accounts are frozen as of this afternoon, pending a federal compliance review." Declan watched the color change in Warren's face. Not dramatic, just a slight draining, the blood moving away from the surface. "I'd like you to tell me, Warren, with the two trust administrators present as witnesses, what services were rendered by the external consultants who received retainer payments from the Mercer subsidiary accounts across the last 8 years? Silence. The two administrators were very still. Warren looked at him for a long moment, and the warmth was gone now. All of it. And what was underneath it was the thing Declan had not seen in 35 years of knowing this man. Not anger, not fear exactly, but something colder and more calculating. The look of a man running options and finding them narrowing. "Those payments," Warren said carefully, "were for legitimate advisory services. They were properly authorized. By whom? By the board's discretionary. Name the consultants," Declan said. Warren said nothing. "Name one of them," Declan said. "One name, one service description, one deliverable from 8 years of retainer payments." The silence stretched. One of the administrators shifted in his chair. The other was looking at Warren with an expression that had moved firmly away from neutral. "I'll need to consult my records," Warren said finally. "Your records are in the estate office," Declan said. "Where I was this afternoon." He paused. "I have the ledger, Warren. I have the notation system. I have the file reference number you used for the correspondence you intercepted." He kept his voice level. He had spent the drive here deciding that he would not do this loudly. Loud was for people who weren't certain. He was certain. "I have both letters. I have the photograph of my son that you filed under a reference number in a locked cabinet and described as held for future disposition." Warren's hands on the table were very still. "And I have," Declan said, "a federal compliance hold on every account those payments move through, which means every transaction will be visible to investigators who are considerably less interested in being reasonable about this than I am." He sat down across from Warren. "So I'm going to ask you one more time, while there's still a version of this conversation that happens in a private room instead of a federal courtroom. Who authorized the payments? What were they for? And what did Arthur Fenwick know?" Warren looked at him for a very long moment. Then he said, "I want an attorney." And in that moment, in the specific quality of those 4 words, in the shift from performing confidence to requesting protection, Declan understood that the picture was larger than the ledger had shown, and that the ledger had shown quite a lot, and that whatever came next was going to be nothing like the careful, managed thing Warren had spent 8 years constructing. The drive back to Seabrake Cove took 40 minutes. Declan spent the first 20 on the phone with Ruth, who had stayed behind at the meeting house to manage the administrators and begin the formal documentation process, and who spoke in the clipped, precise cadence of someone who had shifted from advisory mode to operational mode and found it comfortable there. "Warren asked for counsel," she said, "which means he's calculating. He's not panicking. He's positioning. That's important." "Why?" "Because a panicking man does unpredictable things. A calculating man does predictable ones." A pause. "He's going to try to reach Fenwick before we do. And Fenwick is going to try to move money before the freeze fully propagates through all the sub-accounts. We have maybe 6 hours before they realize the freeze covers everything and shift to a different strategy." "What's the different strategy?" "Discrediting you," Ruth said. "The evidence, the ledger, the chain of custody. They'll argue you broke into the estate, that the documents were taken illegally, that anything you found is inadmissible, and the product of a personal vendetta against a trusted estate manager." Another pause. "They'll also go after Marin, her credibility, her motivations, the nature of your relationship. They'll try to reframe everything as a scheme." Declan's hands tightened on the wheel. How fast can the federal filing move? I'm working on that right now. My contact is good, but good doesn't mean instant. Realistically, we have paperwork in front of investigators by tomorrow morning. She paused. Tonight is the gap. Tonight is when they have room to operate. He understood what she wasn't saying. I'll call you in an hour, he said, and ended the call. He drove the remaining 20 minutes without the phone, which was a thing he rarely did, and in the silence he ran through everything he knew about how Warren operated, the methodical patience of it, the preference for pressure over confrontation, the way Warren had always solved problems not by removing them, but by making them inconvenient for other people to pursue. The warning in the parking lot. Marin standing by her car and Warren telling her she was in a complicated position. Not threatening, advising. That had been pressure. A first application of it, light, meant to test whether Marin would fold on her own, which would have been the cleanest outcome. The woman steps back. Declan is managed away from the situation. The whole thing dissolves without Warren having to do anything more overt. Marin hadn't folded, which meant the next application would not be light. He pressed the accelerator down and watched the coastal road unspool ahead of him in the early evening dark. Diane Cowell lived in a yellow house 3 blocks from the water on the quiet residential side of Seabreak Cove, the kind of street where people had lived for 20 years and knew each other's cars and noticed unfamiliar ones. Declan had chosen her for exactly that quality. Diane was observant, discreet, and owed him nothing, which meant she had no angle on this, no stake, no reason to be anything other than what she was. He pulled up and saw Marin's car in the drive. He sat in his car for a moment with his hand still on the wheel, and he thought about what Ruth had said. Tonight is the gap. And then he got out and knocked. Diane answered. She was 60, lean, with the kind of directness that came from decades of academic work. She'd taught constitutional law at a small college 30 miles inland before retiring, which was how Declan knew her, from a property dispute 6 years ago where she'd been an expert witness, and he'd been impressed enough to keep her number. She looked at him, and then passed him at the street. Anyone follow you? Not that I saw. Come in. She stepped back. Your people are in the kitchen. Your people. He registered the phrase, the weight of it, the casual certainty with which she'd said it, and he walked through Diane's house, which smelled like books and coffee and the particular tidiness of someone who lived alone and liked it, toward the sound of voices. Marin was sitting at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug. Evan was on the floor, back against the cabinet, legs stretched out, working on something with a pencil and a folded piece of paper. He looked up when Declan came in. Hey, Evan said, as if this were ordinary, as if they'd met before properly, as if 8-year-olds ended up in strangers' kitchens all the time and it required no particular comment. Hey, Declan said. Marin was looking at him with the focused, assessing expression he was beginning to recognize as her baseline when she was managing fear. Not hiding it, managing it. There was a difference, and she was someone who understood the difference. Sit down, she said. Tell me what happened. He told her. Concisely, without softening, the ledger, the letters, Fenwick, the frozen accounts, Warren asking for an attorney. He told her what Ruth had said about the gap and about the strategy they'd likely use, and he watched Marin's face while he spoke, watched her process it in real time, the way her jaw tightened when he said, discrediting you, and the way something briefly and intensely hot moved through her eyes when he described the photograph in the manila folder. Evan kept working on his paper airplane. He was either not listening or listening to everything and choosing not to show it. Declan suspected the latter. So tonight, Marin said, tonight they have options we can't fully predict. What are the most likely ones? Pressure on you directly. They may try to reach you or send someone to reach you. They may make contact with your employer, Greta, whoever manages your file at the resort. They may look at Evan's school, his records, try to find something they can use to complicate your credibility. Marin's expression didn't change, but her knuckles, around the mug, went a shade paler. Or, Declan said, they do nothing tonight and move entirely to the legal strategy tomorrow. Attack the evidence, attack the chain of custody, make it a long fight that you don't have resources for. He met her eyes. That's the version I can manage. Ruth can manage. The other versions Are the ones we need to be ready for tonight, Marin said. Yes. Evan looked up from the floor. He had completed the airplane, a precise, narrow dart, folds perfectly even, and he was looking at Declan with the same focused intensity he'd had in the lobby, the same specific quality of attention that made Declan feel like he was being measured by an instrument that didn't miss much. Is someone going to try to hurt us? Evan said. The kitchen went very quiet. Marin opened her mouth, and Declan made a small movement, not quite a gesture, more a slight shift in weight, and she paused, and he looked at Evan. I don't know, he said. I think people are going to try to scare you. I don't know if it goes beyond that. What's the difference between scaring us and hurting us? Intent, Declan said. People who want to scare you want you to make a choice out of fear. People who want to hurt you have already decided you're not going to make the right choice. Evan considered this with the seriousness of someone filing it away. Which do you think these people are? He said. Declan looked at him. I think they're the first kind who are capable of becoming the second kind, which means we're going to make sure they don't get the opportunity. Evan nodded, once, with a gravity that sat oddly on an 8-year-old's face and fit him perfectly. Then he stood up and handed Diane the paper airplane without explanation and went to stand beside his mother, and Marin put her arm around him in the automatic way of someone whose body had made that particular movement 10,000 times. Declan's phone buzzed. Ruth. He stepped into the hall. We have a problem, Ruth said. Her voice had changed. She'd been controlled before, clipped, and operational. Now there was something underneath it that he'd never heard from her, which was the quality of someone who had been surprised by something they should have predicted. What is it? The federal hold. It covered the main accounts, the subsidiaries, everything I filed against. A pause. It didn't cover a private holding structure that isn't listed under the Mercer Trust name. Arthur Fenwick incorporated a shell entity in Delaware 9 years ago. It holds approximately $38 million in what appears to be trust assets that were transferred incrementally and never reported. Another pause. It's been moving money for the last 2 hours. I caught it because my contact flagged unusual activity, but by the time we can get a hold in place on the Delaware entity, he's liquidating, Declan said. He's trying to. We have maybe 4 hours before the assets are in accounts we can't touch. Ruth's voice was even but tight. I need you to make a decision. I can file an emergency injunction tonight, which requires waking up a federal judge and making a compelling case at 9 o'clock in the evening, or we let it move and build the criminal case on the transaction trail. A pause. The transaction trail is better evidence, but $38 million in a jurisdiction we can't follow is also Arthur Fenwick comfortable enough to fight indefinitely. Declan leaned against the wall of Diane's hallway. The wallpaper was pale blue with a pattern of small anchors, and he stared at it, and he made himself think clearly. Emergency injunction, he said. Wake the judge. I'll write a personal statement tonight, whatever you need, whatever makes the case compelling. All right. She was already moving. He could hear it. Get me something in 2 hours. Personal, specific, first-person account of the harm. Include the child. Ruth. It matters, Declan. A child is sympathetic. A child makes this concrete for a judge who is being asked to do something unusual on a weeknight. He closed his eyes for a half-second. 2 hours, he said. He ended the call and stood in the hallway for a moment, and then he went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table across from Marin and said, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. When have I not been? She said. I need to write a statement tonight for a federal judge. It has to include everything. The letters, the photograph, the 9 years, Evan, everything, and it will be part of a public legal record. He held her gaze. I need to know if you're ready for that, because once it's filed, it's not private anymore. Marin looked at him, then she looked at Evan, who was standing with his back against the counter now, arms crossed, listening without pretending not to. What do you think? She said to Evan. Evan uncrossed his arms. He thought about it, genuinely, visibly, with the kind of consideration that most adults didn't bring to things. I think, he said, that if we don't do it and those people get away, then we spent all this time being scared for nothing. He paused. And I don't like being scared for nothing. Marin turned back to Declan. Write the statement, she said. He wrote for 90 minutes at Diane's kitchen table, longhand first, and then typed on Diane's laptop, while Marin put Evan to bed in the guest room and Diane made coffee and read in the other room with a deliberate tact that he appreciated. He wrote without flinching, which was the hardest part. The precision required to describe injury without performing it, to lay out 9 years of absence and its consequences in language that was factual and devastating and not a single word more dramatic than the facts required. He described the storm, the boathouse, the specific quality of a night that had mattered, and the morning after that had been taken from both of them before they knew it was being taken. He described the letters in the cabinet, the reference number, the notation, held for future disposition. He described Evan, not sentimentally, the paper airplane in the lobby, the bench in the garden, the question in Diane's kitchen. Is someone going to try to hurt us? He sent it to Ruth at 11:17. She responded 12 minutes later. Good. This is good. Filing now. He sat back in Diane's kitchen chair and rubbed his face with both hands, and he was aware of being very tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour, the specific bone-deep exhaustion of a day that had moved through too many registers, cold rage and legal calculation, and the particular devastation of holding a photograph that had been hidden from him for 8 years. Marin came back into the kitchen. She'd been upstairs for 20 minutes, and she sat down across from him and poured herself the last of the coffee and said nothing for a moment, which he was grateful for. Then her phone rang. She looked at the screen. An unfamiliar number. He could see that from across the table, could see the slight change in her posture, the shoulders pulling back a fraction. She answered and put it on speaker without being asked. Ms. Calloway. A man's voice. Not Warren. Someone smoother, younger, the practiced tone of a person who made calls like this professionally. My name isn't important. I'm calling on behalf of certain parties who have an interest in the resolution of the current situation. It's late, Marin said. Her voice was completely flat. I understand. I'll be brief. The parties I represent are prepared to offer a settlement, substantial, private, structured to ensure the long-term financial security of you and your son without any further complexity. A pause. In exchange for a standard non-disclosure agreement and a withdrawal of any paternity-related claims. Declan looked at Marin across the table. How much? Marin said. A pause. The man recalibrated slightly. She'd said it like someone considering. The initial offer is $2 million, structured over 5 years, with a... No, Marin said. Ms. Calloway, I'd encourage you to consider no. Tell whoever is paying you to make this call that the answer is no, and that the next call they want to make should be to their own attorney, because ours filed papers 40 minutes ago. She ended the call. The kitchen was very quiet. $2 million, Declan said. Less than what they're trying to move out of the country, Marin said. She set her phone face down on the table. They're scared. Yes. Scared people do things. Yes. She looked at him steadily. So what do we do between now and when Ruth gets an answer from the judge? We stay here. We don't open doors. We don't answer calls from numbers we don't recognize. He paused. And we wait. It was the hardest word in the sentence. She knew it, and he knew it. Marin Calloway was not built for waiting. She was built for the forward movement of someone who had survived alone by never stopping, never being caught standing still long enough for something to catch up to her. She picked up her mug and held it with both hands, not drinking, just holding it. Tell me something, she said. Before all of this, before you found the letters, what were you going to do? If the DNA test had come back and if it was what we both knew it was going to be and there was nothing else, no Warren, no Fenwick, no stolen letters, just a man who hadn't known and a woman who thought he'd chosen not to know. She looked at him. What were you going to do? He thought about it honestly, which was the only way the question deserved to be answered. I don't know, he said. I know what I wanted. I know that seeing him in the lobby did something I haven't been able to account for since. But what I would have done? How you would have let me? How Evan would have... I don't know. He held her gaze. What I know is that I would have tried, whatever that was worth. She looked at him for a moment, then she nodded, once, and that was all. At 12:43 in the morning, Ruth called. "Judge signed," she said. "The injunction covers the Delaware entity and 3 associated accounts. Federal marshals will serve Fenwick in the morning." A breath. He'd never heard Ruth breathe audibly before, and he understood that the breath was relief. "It's not over, but the money doesn't move." Declan relayed this to Marin, who closed her eyes for 3 seconds. "Try to sleep," he told her. "I'll take the couch. I'm not leaving tonight." She looked at him with an expression that was too complicated to name. Not gratitude exactly, not the absence of it either. Something that lived in the specific register of a person recalibrating their understanding of another person in real time. "Diane's couch is uncomfortable," she said. "I'll manage." She stood, paused. Then, with the particular decisiveness of someone making a choice they've thought through completely, "There's a chair in the guest room. Evan sleeps through anything." She turned toward the stairs. "Don't make that mean something it doesn't." "I won't," he said. He followed her upstairs, and in the quiet of the guest room, Evan slept with one arm thrown over his head and his breathing steady and untroubled, and Declan sat in the chair in the corner of the room and watched the rise and fall of the boy's chest, and thought about $38 million and a federal injunction and a photograph in a manila folder, and how strange and specific the machinery of a life was. How many small things had to align in exactly the wrong configuration to produce 9 years of absence, and how many small things had to align in exactly the right one to produce a collision in a hotel lobby that cracked it all open. He didn't sleep. At 3:20 in the morning, the alert on his phone came through. A notification from the monitoring service Ruth had put on the estate property. Motion detected. Side entrance. His whole body went cold. He was out of the chair before he'd fully processed it, his hand on Marin's shoulder in the dark, her eyes open immediately. She'd been barely asleep, hovering in the shallow water of it, and he showed her the phone without speaking. She sat up. "Evan," she said very quietly. "He's here. He's fine." Declan was already at the window, looking down at the street. Diane's house, not the estate. The alert was from the estate. But the estate was where the remaining physical documents were. The secondary files he hadn't taken, the hard drives in Warren's desk system that contained... His phone rang. Unknown number. He picked it up. Breathing. Nothing else for 2 seconds. Then a voice he recognized, older and more controlled than the man Ruth's contact had described. A voice that belonged to someone who had spent 50 years learning how to make requests sound like observations. "Mr. Mercer," Arthur Fenwick said. "I think it's time we spoke directly." Declan moved to the doorway of the guest room, keeping one eye on Evan's sleeping shape and one hand tight around the phone, and he said, "I'm listening." "The injunction is an inconvenience," Fenwick said. The word was chosen with the care of someone who understood that minimizing a threat was its own form of threat, that naming it small made it small. "You froze our operational capacity based on documents taken without authorization from private property," Fenwick continued. "Any competent attorney will have that injunction dissolved by Friday." "Ruth Kessler isn't any competent attorney," Declan said, "and the documents weren't taken from private property. I have a key. I've always had a key. It's my estate." A pause. Very brief. "The ledger," Fenwick said, "is an internal accounting document written in a notation system that only Warren fully understands. It will be characterized as such." "Warren asked for an attorney 4 hours ago," Declan said, "which means Warren is already calculating what he's willing to trade. I don't think you want to wait and find out what Warren decides his own freedom is worth relative to yours." The silence on the other end lasted 6 seconds. Declan counted them. "What do you want?" Fenwick said. The warmth was gone now, completely. What was left was just the mechanism. Old, practiced, stripped of its casing. "I want the full accounting," Declan said. "Every transfer, every shell entity, every dollar that moved out of the Mercer Trust across the last 22 years. I want it documented and submitted to federal investigators voluntarily, with your full cooperation before 7 o'clock tomorrow morning." "That's not a negotiation." "No," Declan said. "It's not." He looked at Evan sleeping in the blue dark of the guest room, one arm over his head, breathing steady. "You had a choice 9 years ago. Someone brought you a problem. A woman who'd written letters, A child who was going to complicate your access to $60 million in discretionary assets. And you made a decision. You decided that a photograph of an 8-month-old boy was a liability to be managed. His voice stayed level. He had decided that too, in the kitchen, hours ago, that he would not do this with heat. Heat was for people who weren't certain. I'm not giving you a choice now. I'm telling you what happens next. What you decide is whether you're part of the accounting or part of what gets accounted for. Another silence. Longer. I'll need until morning, Fenwick said. You have until 7. He ended the call. Marin was in the doorway, arms crossed, watching him. She'd heard enough. Do you think he'll do it? She said. No, Declan said. But I think the call scared him enough to slow him down. And slow is all we need until Ruth files the criminal referral at 8. She looked at him for a moment. Then she went back to the narrow bed in the corner of the room, and she lay down on top of the covers with her shoes still on, which was the posture of someone who was not sleeping but was allowing her body to rest. And Declan went back to the chair, and in the blue-gray dark of the room, the three of them, a man in a chair, a woman on a bed, a boy deep in uncomplicated sleep, waited for morning. Morning came the way mornings come after bad nights. Not gently. Gray light through the curtains first, then the sound of birds, then the particular flatness of a world that had not, despite everything, stopped turning. At 6:47, Ruth called. Fenwick's attorney contacted the U.S. Attorney's Office at 6:15, she said. He's cooperating. Full disclosure, voluntary submission of records, the Delaware entity, all of it. A pause that had something in it. Not quite satisfaction. Something more complicated and less clean. Warren is cooperating separately. They're each trying to be more useful than the other, which means investigators are going to have more information than they can process by lunchtime. Declan sat in the chair with the phone against his ear and felt the specific deflation that followed the end of a sustained effort. Not happiness, not relief exactly, something quieter and more exhausted than either. The estate? He said. Frozen pending full audit. It'll take months to untangle the trust from the shell structures, but the assets are secured. Ruth paused. You're going to be in depositions for a long time, Declan. I know. And the media? I know. It's going to be loud. Ruth. He stopped her. I know, thank you. A brief pause. Get some sleep, she said, and ended the call. He sat in the chair and looked at the window and the gray light coming through it, and then he looked at Evan, who was still asleep, and at Marin, who was awake and looking at the ceiling with her hands folded on her stomach, and he said, It's done. She turned her head to look at him. Which part? She said. The part that happens in the dark, he said. The rest is going to be loud and slow, and it's going to happen in public. But the part that happens in the dark is done. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat up, put her feet on the floor, and looked at Evan. He's going to wake up hungry, she said. Diane has eggs. I'll make breakfast. She stood. You look terrible. I know. She went downstairs and Declan stayed in the chair. And 2 minutes later, Evan opened his eyes and looked at the ceiling and then looked at Declan in the chair and said, with the uncanny practicality of children who process the world while they sleep, Is it over? Most of it, Declan said. Evan considered this. What's the rest? The part where everyone finds out. Courts, newspapers, people asking questions. About me? Yes. Evan was quiet for a moment. He sat up and pushed his hair out of his face and looked at Declan with the specific directness that Declan was learning to expect from him, the look that did not soften what it was looking at. Are you my dad? Evan said. The word landed in the room and stayed there. Declan looked at him. At the jaw he recognized and the eyes he recognized, and the particular quality of attention that he was beginning to understand, he also recognized because it was his own, had always been his own, and had been sitting across from him in gardens and lobbies, and borrowed kitchens for 10 days without him having the right word for what he was looking at. Yes, he said. Evan looked at him for another moment. Then he nodded, once, with the same gravity he'd brought to every serious thing. Okay, Evan said. He got up and went downstairs to find his mother, and Declan sat in the empty chair in the gray morning light, and for the first time in 10 days, he let himself be still. What? The federal case against Arthur Fenwick and Warren Holt took 11 months to move from indictment to trial. In that time, the Mercer Family Trust was restructured under independent judicial oversight. 22 years of fraudulent transfers were mapped by forensic accountants across 4 firms, and the true scope of what Fenwick had built, quietly, incrementally, over 2 decades of trusted service, became visible in the particular way that things become visible when they are finally placed in light. Larger than anyone had imagined, and somehow both more and less surprising than it should have been. $38 million in diverted assets, 14 shell entities across 3 jurisdictions. Warren Holt had been paid, across 8 years, $640,000 to manage, as Fenwick's attorneys eventually characterized it in filings they clearly hoped would minimize what they were describing. Information flow within the Mercer principal's personal affairs. Information flow. 2 letters. 1 photograph of an 8-month-old child, filed under a reference number, held for future disposition. The phrase appeared in the indictment, and it appeared in the press coverage, and it appeared in the statements of 3 members of Congress who sat on the committee that subsequently reviewed trust law protections for beneficiaries. And it appeared on the cover of a financial crimes publication, above a photograph of the Mercer estate that made the stone walls and the long driveway look exactly like what they had always been, a monument to the idea that certain things could be permanent. Nothing was permanent. That was the lesson, if there was one. Everything that had been built on concealment had the same structural problem. It required maintenance, and maintenance required trust, and trust was a thing that could be withdrawn. Fenwick's trial lasted 3 weeks. Warren's was shorter. He had cooperated thoroughly enough to reduce his exposure, and his sentencing reflected that, though not in the way he had hoped. There were, it turned out, limits to how useful a man could be after the full extent of what he'd done had been made visible to investigators who took child welfare implications very seriously. Declan sat through every day of the trials. He had not planned to. Ruth had told him it wasn't necessary, that his deposition testimony was sufficient, that attending would only extend his exposure to press coverage that was already extensive and exhausting. He had attended anyway because it had seemed to him that the specific category of thing Warren and Fenwick had done, the managed disappearance of people from each other's lives, the reduction of a child to a reference number, deserved to be witnessed by someone with standing to witness it, and he was the person with the most standing. Marin did not attend. She had given her deposition, calm, precise, devastating in its specificity. And then she had gone back to Seabrake Cove and back to her life. And Declan had understood that this was the correct choice for her, even though it cost him something he couldn't easily name. She was not a person who organized herself around the punishment of people who had wronged her. She was a person who organized herself around what came next. He was learning that about her, in the specific way you learn things about a person when the emergency has passed, and what remains is just the texture of who they actually are. Dicum? They had dinner for the first time. Properly, deliberately, a thing they chose rather than a thing necessity had arranged, 7 weeks after Fenwick's trial concluded. Not at Ocean Crest. Somewhere smaller, on the water, a place that had been there since before the resort expansion and had not updated its menu or its lighting in 20 years, and was, for that reason, the kind of place where the food tasted like someone had made it rather than performed it. Evan had lobbied to come. Marin had said not this time, and Evan had accepted this with the same considered seriousness with which he accepted most things, which was to say that he had argued for approximately 4 minutes, and then, upon receiving an explanation that he found logically adequate, had stopped arguing and moved on. He was staying with Diane, who had, over the past months, become something between a neighbor and a fixed point in all of their lives, the woman who made coffee and asked practical questions and did not editorialize about things that weren't her business. Declan arrived first and sat at the corner table and looked at the water, which was dark and moving, catching light from the dock lamps in long, broken lines. He had spent a great deal of time looking at water in the last year. It had begun to seem not peaceful exactly, but honest, a thing that was what it was without negotiation. Marin came in and sat across from him and ordered wine before she said anything else, which he took as a reasonable indicator of how she was feeling about the evening, which was probably some combination of things that didn't resolve cleanly. "How are you?" she said. "Tired," he said. "You?" "Also tired." She looked at the menu without reading it. "Ruth called me. She said the trust restructuring is almost finalized. Next month. The Independent Oversight Board takes over permanently in January. And you? And me what? What do you do in January?" She set the menu down and looked at him directly, which was always how she looked at people when she was asking something that mattered. "The trust runs itself now. The legal circus is over. What does Declan Mercer do?" He thought about it honestly. "I don't entirely know yet. That's either concerning or healthy. I can't tell which. Probably both." He looked at her. "I know I'm here. I know what I want to be here for. Beyond that," he paused. "I spent 20 years being very certain about exactly what I was doing and exactly what it was worth. That certainty felt like competence. I'm not sure it was." She looked at him for a moment. "Evan asked me last week if you were going to move to Seabreak Cove." "What did you say?" "I said I didn't know, that we hadn't talked about it." She picked up her wine glass. "He said that was probably something we should figure out because he didn't want things to be weird." She paused. "He used the word weird. He said it 3 times. He's not wrong." "No." A slight softening around her eyes. Not quite a smile, the thing that preceded a smile. "He's not wrong about most things. It's genuinely inconvenient." I noticed. She looked at the water for a moment, and he looked at her looking at it, and the restaurant was quiet around them in the particular way of places that have been serving food for a long time, and understand that silence is not a problem to be filled. "I'm not asking you to have a plan," she said finally. I know this is complicated. I know there's no version of it that isn't complicated, because there's Evan, and there's what happened, and there's the fact that we've spent 9 years not knowing each other, and we're trying to figure out if the 10 days in the middle of a crisis means anything about what we actually are to each other." She met his eyes. "I'm just asking you to be honest about what you want and what you're capable of and what you don't know, because that's all I've ever asked anyone for, and it's the one thing no one in the last 9 years has managed to give me." He held her gaze. "I want to be here," he said. "I want to be where Evan is. I want to know what he's going to build next and what he's going to argue about and what kind of person he becomes, and I want to be a thing he doesn't have to explain to himself." He paused. "And I want to know you, not the version of you that existed in a boathouse during a storm, and not the version that managed a crisis with people trying to dismantle her life. The regular version, the one who exists on ordinary days." Marin looked at him. "The ordinary version is pretty tired," she said. "I know. I'm not asking for performance." He kept his voice level. "I'm asking for time, if you'll give it." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the water moved, the dock lights making their broken patterns. "I'll think about it," she said, which, he had learned, was Marin Calloway's version of yes. The Coastal Foundation had been Marin's idea, and she had not told Declan about it until it was already 3 months into operation, which was characteristic of her. She did not present plans, she presented accomplished facts, because she had learned across years of doing things alone that plans invited interference, and facts invited only the option to accept or refuse. He had not interfered. He had written the initial funding, substantial, though she had argued the figure down twice before accepting it, and he had let her because the arguing was the point, because she needed the foundation to be something she had negotiated for, rather than something given. And then he had stepped back and watched her build it. It served single parents in economic crisis along the coastal communities, not just Seabreak Cove, but the 7 towns that bracketed it north and south, the smaller ones that didn't have resort economies and didn't have the visibility that came with resort economies. Legal aid, emergency housing assistance, childcare subsidy, a network of volunteer advisors who had worked their way through exactly the kind of institutional indifference that Marin had navigated alone for 9 years and understood, with the specificity of personal experience, how to route around. She ran it from an office above a hardware store 3 blocks from the water, with 2 full-time staff members and a rotating roster of volunteers, and the kind of operational efficiency that came from a woman who had spent 6 years running a luxury resort floor on insufficient sleep and inadequate staffing, and had developed, in that crucible, an almost alarming capacity for practical problem-solving. Declan came by the office sometimes, in the late afternoon, with coffee. He did not come every day. He had understood fairly quickly that coming every day would mean something he hadn't been invited to mean yet, and that meaning something you hadn't been invited to mean was exactly the kind of presumption that had characterized the men Marin had learned to be careful around. So he came when she texted, and he texted when something seemed worth texting about, and on the days when Evan was with him, they had arranged this slowly, carefully, in increments that Evan had largely designed himself, with a specificity that continued to startle Declan. I want to come on weekends, but not every weekend because sometimes I need to be home. He brought Evan to the office sometimes, and Evan would sit in the corner and do his homework and occasionally ask Marin's staff members questions about what they were working on with a focused, practical curiosity that had begun to endear him to people who previously hadn't had much reason to think about what kind of person an 8-year-old could be. He was 9 now. His birthday had been in October. They had eaten cake on Diane's porch. Marin, Declan, Evan, Diane, and Otis the groundskeeper from Ocean Crest, who had been invited because Evan had insisted, and who had brought a bottle of something Declan didn't recognize and stayed until 11, and turned out to have extremely specific opinions about tidal fishing that he and Evan had argued about in the particular way of 2 people who liked arguing because they liked the same subject. Declan had sat on his porch and watched his son argue about tide tables with a 60-year-old groundskeeper and thought about the ledger in the filing cabinet and the photograph in the manila folder and the notation held for future disposition, and felt something he didn't have an exact word for, something in the vicinity of grief and gratitude simultaneously, the particular feeling of understanding what you nearly didn't have. He ran into Warren Holt once, not by design. Warren had been released pending appeal. His cooperation had kept him out of immediate custody, a fact that Declan had opinions about and had chosen not to act on because Ruth had been very clear that acting on it would complicate the appeal, and the appeal was important. And they crossed paths on a Saturday morning outside the post office on the main street of Seabreak Cove, which was the kind of accidental geography that small coastal towns specialized in. Warren looked older, not dramatically. A few months wasn't enough for dramatic, but he looked like a man whose internal architecture had shifted, the way buildings looked after earthquakes when the structure was technically intact, but something in the foundation had moved and the walls reflected it in ways that were difficult to articulate. They stopped. Warren opened his mouth. "Don't," Declan said. Warren closed it. They stood on the sidewalk for a moment, the ordinary Saturday morning moving around them. A woman with a stroller, a man with a dog, the sound of the water somewhere past the buildings. And then Warren nodded, once, with the specific quality of a man accepting something he couldn't argue, and walked away. And Declan watched him go and felt nothing in particular, which was not what he had expected. He had expected anger or satisfaction or the completion of some emotional circuit. What he felt was the absence of all of those things, a kind of clean emptiness, as if the space that had been occupied by this particular weight had simply been cleared. He went to the post office and mailed what he'd come to mail and walked back to his car in the October sun and called Marin. "I saw Warren," he said. "And?" "Nothing," he said. "It was nothing." A pause on her end. "Are you okay?" "Yes," he said, and it was true. And the truth of it was uncomplicated in a way he wasn't entirely used to. Sad. The last evening of the year was cold and clear, the kind of cold that came off the water and meant it, that got into your coat and the space between your collar and your jaw and made the stars look bright and very far away. They were on the beach south of the resort, the public access beach that the resort had never managed to absorb despite occasional efforts, the stretch where the sand was coarser and the rocks broke through at the waterline, and it was not, by any standard, the resort would apply. Picturesque. It was the beach that the people who lived in Seabreak Cove used because it was theirs, had always been theirs, and they had held on to it the way you held on to things that the machinery of money and development periodically tried to take, stubbornly, persistently, and without fanfare. Evan was running ahead of them along the waterline in the specific way he had, not aimlessly, but tracking something, watching where the waves left the sand smooth and dark, and then retreated, testing the edge of it with his sneakers in a game whose rules only he knew. He had on a red jacket that was visible from a distance and had been Marin's condition for letting him run ahead. Marin walked with her hands in her pockets and her shoulder occasionally near Declan's shoulder, and the quality of silence between them that had developed over months. Comfortable without being complacent, the silence of two people who had stopped performing ease and had found something that actually was. "He wants a dog," Marin said. "I know. He told me. He's been telling everyone. He told Diane. He told Otis. He told the woman at the foundation who does the legal intake, who he met for approximately 12 minutes. A pause. "He's building a coalition. He's gonna win," Declan said. "I know he's going to win." She said it with the particular mixture of resignation and warmth that characterized how she talked about Evan in moments when she wasn't aware she was being observed. "I've known he was going to win since October. I'm just making him work for it because the process is good for him." Ahead of them, Evan discovered something at the waterline. A shell, a piece of driftwood, something the sea had decided to leave behind, and crouched to examine it with total absorption, the red jacket vivid against the dark sand. Declan looked at him. He thought about the lobby, the paper airplane and the skidding sneakers, and the 30 seconds of stillness in which he had looked at a child's face and understood, without language, without proof, that something had just changed irreversibly. He thought about the drive through the coastal hills and the ledger and the two letters and the photograph, and he thought about Ruth's voice saying, "Judge signed in the 3 o'clock dark," and Warren's face doing its small, fast recalibration in the meeting house, and the specific sound of Fenwick's voice calling an injunction and inconvenience. He thought about a boathouse in a storm and a woman he'd talked to for 6 hours and the morning after, and the year after, and the 8 years after that, and how much of a life could be altered by a decision someone else made in a moment you were never part of. He thought about all of it, and it settled into him the way things settled when they were over. Not neatly, not without remainder, but completely. Done. Accounted for. "Marin," he said. She looked at him. He didn't say anything else immediately. He looked at her in the cold evening light. The particular lines of her face, the way she held herself, the quality of attention she brought to everything, this woman who had raised an extraordinary person alone and built something real out of circumstances that had not been fair and had never asked anyone to notice that they weren't. "Thank you," he said. She looked at him steadily. "For what?" "For the letters," he said. "For writing them when you didn't have to. For choosing to believe I was a good man even when the evidence said otherwise." He paused. "For letting me be here." Marin held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like the last layer of a kept distance making a quiet decision, the way ice makes a decision in March. "You're not here yet," she said. "Not all the way. I know. But you're—" She looked at Evan, who had stood up from his crouching examination of the waterline and was now launching the piece of driftwood experimentally into a wave, watching it tumble. "You're getting there." It was not a declaration, it was not a resolution, it was the thing that came before both of those things, the tentative weight shift of two people standing at the edge of something that was not yet named and did not yet need to be. Evan turned and shouted something at them. The wind took the words, left only the tone, which was gleeful and demanding. He was waving them forward. Marin started walking. Declan walked beside her, their shoulders close without quite touching, and ahead of them Evan was already turning back to the water, already looking for the next thing, the next shell, the next wave, the next problem that required his particular quality of attention. The tide was going out. It pulled at the sand with the sound it had always made, indifferent and steady, and behind them it erased their footprints one by one as they walked. The marks they'd made smoothed back into nothing, until the beach behind them was unmarked and the only direction that held their shape was forward, into the dark and the cold and the ordinary, extraordinary fact of being here, being alive, being known.